Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. How do you make the business case to retain or add headcount to your procurement team? Well, that's the question that I explore in today's Art of Procurement podcast with my guest, Alexis Ryan. Alexis is the former head of global strategic sourcing at BioMarin Pharmaceutical, and she's previously enjoyed procurement leadership roles at Novartis, Becton Dickinson, and Pfizer. Now, we recorded this conversation right at the beginning of the coronavirus lockdown here in the US, but while we focused at the time on growing headcount, I do think that Alexis's advice is just as relevant if you're looking to retain headcount as your organization looks for opportunities to reduce FTEs. So as we go into the conversation, I start by asking Alexis what I ask a lot of my guests, and that is if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
I say we found each other. I'm a lawyer by background and education. And when I was in law school, I focused on contract and commercial law. Through my father, I met some procurement people at Merck in the corporate procurement department. And they were looking for someone, and they were intrigued by my legal background because of the health and the expertise in contracts. And then myself, liking contract creation, negotiation. I had never really thought of procurement, but saw that procurement does a lot in that space. And they had an opening. I joined Merck Corporate Procurement in the HR area, and the past 20 years now I've been in procurement.
So as a lawyer coming into procurement, well, were there any preconceived ideas of what procurement was from the outside that maybe surprised you with what the reality on the ground was when you got inside of procurement?
Not really. I just wasn't aware of procurement before I started talking to people in procurement. If you had asked me in a company who's involved in the contracts, I probably would have said the law department. Again, I just didn't know that there even really was a procurement. No preconceived notions on my part. However, when I work with, for example, the lawyers in a company as a stakeholder group, I see a lot of preconceived notions on how procurement operates and what procurement brings.
And I think that's one of our challenges, isn't it, of selling the value proposition of procurement. And really aligning what we do with what the business truly needs from a procurement group, rather than going with more of a one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely. And in some areas, more so than others.
Yeah. Now, I'd love, just for context, if you could share a little bit about the types of procurement teams that you have then led as you have been involved in the procurement profession and obviously grown up the ladder, if you will, of responsibility within procurement.
I'd say 8 years ago, as I started in the global category manager role, I started by managing a team of matrix resources. So procurement in function, procurement in division or geography that had my category as part of their scope. So managing their efforts in the work, not people managing. Around 5 years ago, as I moved into more of a leadership role over a general area, I had then 10 say, FTEs who are concentrated, who are all globally focused as a direct reporting line. And that came at the same time as the company I was in consolidated procurement into one global function, if you will.
Yeah.
And then, so then after that, most recently, as I've led the function, strategic sourcing, my team they've all sat in one place. They do have global scope, and it's kind of a double level reporting relationship. Right. And they, just like the first, when I was an area lead, they all have different category areas. And within being the function head of strategic sourcing, same thing, managing people who have maybe a common remit, but for different areas of the business.
And so I think what we want to talk about in the conversation today, it's a really interesting conversation, especially when we think about, the context of how the world is changing. The world is changing in front of our eyes every day right now. And the role of procurement, we talked a little bit about, actually before we recorded off mic, about how we're part of the solution that a lot of organizations will have, the challenges that organizations will have right now, but you're in a constrained resource environment where there isn't necessarily the budget to invest in the resources that you absolutely would need. So really the topic of conversation is how do we make the business case for that procurement headcount? And I'd love to just kind of start jumping into that by first asking, in any environment, really, when is the right time for procurement to actually go to leadership and ask for additional headcount or make the case for additional headcount?
Ideally, if there is some form of general restructuring going on, or if multiple functions are looking at how they're staffed, how they operate, perfect time to go and see it, because it naturally fits in with a look at how you're running your business, how you're structured. Otherwise, it's generally an end of the year for the next year.
Okay.
As you're in fourth quarter, you're presenting your case going forward for the following year, what staff you need to have in place. If it's more than you had, why? Yeah. What ROI, what benefit will that additional resourcing bring to the table? The other interesting thing, and I've seen both in companies, is what's more important, function cost or function headcount. Mm-hmm. I say this because FTEs, internal resources, are generally less expensive than external resources, and the least expensive, generally external resource, contingent labor, also typically counts as headcount. It's a weird dynamic because you would think function cost would always drive. In many cases, it doesn't. It's function headcount instead of cost. That's the real key driver.
Do you think that that's going to become even more of a driving factor going forward when you have organizations who are looking at headcount from a really the organizational level and also the department level, because they have to, it's difficult to be seen to be investing in headcount in one area when you're cutting headcount in the other, but then you're bringing in resource from outside, which may be more expensive because you still have jobs that need to be done.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's counterintuitive. You look and you say, they're going to outsource XYZ. It'll be twice as expensive to do it. You'll have a learning curve each time. Why are they doing it? As far as I know, headcount also gets reported to the street along with cost, and it looks bad for headcount to be going up. You also have some leaders who just, their going position is, we should only have internal people doing things that are core to the business. Yep. Everything else should be outsourced, and you kind of have to work backwards, understanding that you've got that hurdle to get over before you even start to make a positive case. It's interesting because I haven't seen it at the company level, FTE review at the company level or at the department level. I've seen it more at the area level. So if you look at manufacturing as an area, if you look at R&D as an area made up of several departments, and then procurement itself will often fall into finance or operations areas where it's harder to get headcount than it would be in R&D or it would be in marketing. It kind of get lumped in with the other, what they call back office functions.
Seen as a business expense.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be harder, and then you're going to be competing with the other functions within that area. Financial transaction support, accounting will be competing, say, with procurement for FTEs or who gets increases, who gets FTE cuts.
Now, as you think about the makeup of you're kind of architecting the team, and you talked a little bit about, whether it's contingent workforce or outsourcing versus direct hires, and how, that's driven sometimes by strategy, but also by circumstance. Now, what role does the investment in technology and automation play in that too? When you think about it from a budget perspective, are you seeing that those are, you think about ways that you can drive efficiencies in your team, are those budgets coming from somewhere else, and therefore it may be easier or harder to get resources to drive efficiencies through technology? Or are those part of kind of the big picture when you're thinking about how I need to resource and staff my team?
Budget-wise, I see it rolled into the group budget. So, for example, with procurement, and I've almost never not seen a line for some kind of system rollout, some kind of system upgrade, some kind of system changeover. You'll see that always as a line in the budget, generally for a couple $1 million at least. It's always there. I think, just my own 2 cents, that technology is almost becoming a strategy in and of itself, which I don't believe it is. I believe it's a component of procurement being more integral to the business, being more successful. It's not something in and of itself that's going to drive procurement. However, when you're looking at the FTE, as you're making cases for more FTEs, you are going to have to show that you seriously considered whatever the technology investments underway are, to see if they could do the work or if they could take other pieces of work off your current resources plates so they can pick up that work that can't be done by technology or that can't be accomplished through process improvement.
Now, as you think about the big kind of picture, do you use, are there particular productivity or utilization metrics or spend under management, that you help to build the case that says, I have my team are strategically managing X number of suppliers. That's not sustainable for these reasons. This is how bringing in extra resources is going to relieve that and also allow us to do different things? Or, how do you think about the metrics to kind of tie to the business case of investing in more people?
First thing is spend under management, I would say. You're staffing against areas of spend. So say, for example, marketing areas are very well staffed. That $400 million, say it will, is under management. And you look at what savings are being driven against that. Say it's 8% savings. And then you look and you have facilities and HR, and they're not managed at all. You have no resources there, and it's $300 million. You could go back and say, in an area where we are well staffed, we generate 8% on $400 million. Here's $300 million that's not staffed. Do the staffing the same way, 8%, and here's a number. The other thing is, you mentioned sustainability. How many suppliers? Is it sustainable? Are there risks? Are there things that procurement hasn't been able to support, for example, acquisition or divestiture activity. Has procurement not been able to support them well in the past, or has something happened in some of these more critical areas, supplier or contract related, that's put the business at risk or in trouble or created issues? You could use those holes to say, we're too thinly staffed, we don't have enough eyes or enough management on these key contracts with key suppliers. If something happens, that could shut down production, that could create incredibly bad press. There could be a bribery issue. So you can also, as you're looking at metrics, spend under management, savings, return. Also, I would say looking at those risks and what could happen and the likelihood.
Now, as you are, thinking about what do you tie that ROI to, and you mentioned before about, the couple of scenarios where you may be going in asking for headcount. One is end of year, what do I need next year to deliver on, my objectives. The second one is when it's related to a burning platform. And I think a lot of procurement leaders now will be faced with that situation where, we have, and while we talk a lot about driving value beyond savings, a lot of organizations right now, expense reduction, expense management is going to be coming to the fore probably more than it has been for the last few years. So you have this burning platform now from an organization, probably an initiative to reduce expenses. Now, is it typically something where you see procurement being proactive to say, okay, this is how I can help you as an organization reach some of these targets that we've set ourselves? Or do you find that you're more involved in actually setting the deliverable, that's going to roll up into this program, and therefore to execute, this is the level of resources that I need?
What I've typically seen is in the front. So as you're understanding from the CEO, from corporate goals, we have a reduction target. We want to reduce operating expenses. Yeah. Procurement goes into executive leadership and says, we would love to run a program with you on this. This is what we're going to do. We're going to identify opportunities in your given areas. We're going to risk, impact, what it can deliver, and we'll present them to you business leaders, and you decide what you want to move forward with. And we'll have little teams set up with your people, and we'll carry them forward. I see them on the front end as being proactive and saying, and it's always the same thing, okay, we've got the center stage like we've never had before. We've got to go in with ideas. If they don't want to accept them, they don't want to accept them. I know we can't force them to do X, Y, Z. We need to make the good case. We need to keep going in. And when they accept things, then we'll roll them forward and we'll hold ourselves accountable, and we'll be reporting back to the executive governing body on how the programs are going.
Yeah.
Did that make sense? Was that?
It does. Yeah. So
or was that confusing?
No. So it's typically more proactive in aligning what procurement do to support a broader, organizational objective in ways that, obviously there's going to be a lot of investment decisions that are made in how do we actually achieve that number, that goal, whatever it is. Proactively putting yourself forward in terms of the way that procurement as a tool can be used to achieve some of those goals. What are some of the objections that you often see that you need to overcome as you're having that conversation? When a CFO, CEO, whoever is faced with procurement as just one of many different investment areas or potential investment areas where you can't invest in everything.
Yeah, the first thing that comes back, I think, and from me as the other function is if there is an overall FTE restraint, any that you're getting are going to have to come from somewhere else. Yeah. And you will typically see other business leaders being a little bit protective of their functions. And I don't think it's competing across the corporation. Like I said, I think it's competing within general areas. Right. So within finance, for example, you're going to have, say, the head of accounting pushing back on the need for precious resources to go to procurement versus going to accounting. And generally, the general push, I mean, because it's got to seem business focused, is did you really, really consider the technology solutions and process improvement, what they could achieve if they were used to their fullest potential, and what do you have your people doing? So a look, and you'd have to be prepared to show that, for example, if you have FTEs in high-cost locations, headquarter locations, sitting with stakeholders, are they only doing the strategic work, or do you have them doing like contract amendments, things that could be done by technology or by resources somewhere else? The other thing that will come up, especially if a company is investing in shared service center in lower cost locations, have you fully considered what work could be moved to those shared service centers? And oftentimes companies will they'll want to add headcount in those low cost shared service centers because it looks good business model. So it's a plus if you can move work there, and even if you're asking to add headcount for those, it's very different than asking for departmental headcount.
Yeah, I've back in my my practitioner days, I actually was I spent time in India running a captive. Well, in those days it was called a captive, but really a shared services function for procurement. And lots of reasons why an organization would want to invest there. But one of the reasons that it's not just about cost, it's you want to provide an organization that feels like it's got growth and has the scale for bringing people in and they're going to stay, because you have such big retention issues in locations like that where you don't have a good career path. So, you kind of, as you say, fighting against multiple different pressures. The final question that I really had on the topic that I think is really important is, we'll be making a proactive request, based on a business case, obviously, for additional resource for headcount, or just, a budget expansion. Do you position it, or would you position it as a little bit of an all or nothing? Like, this is what I need to get what I need, and go and make the ask all at once, or have a position where it's more of an iterative? At this point, we think we need X resource. At point Y, we need additional resource based on how we went at point X, so that you can kind of use the go slowly, make it an easier investment decision, and then use the successes from that earlier investment to hopefully help grow, so that it's an easier decision to invest more later.
I believe so. I'll answer that two ways. One is make the request all at once, not for all the resources at once, but don't make a series of requests. Yeah. You can have that one request that says, this year we want to add one FTE that will do this. Yeah. 2 years later, we want to add another FTE that will do this. It can be iterative, and oftentimes it is, although funny enough, sometimes it's iterative in the other direction. So iterative in terms of, we want to add, next year we need a resource sitting in this headquarter location to do the business partnering, develop the area, and then 2 years later, we will move that FTE to a lower cost location or a shared service center that's being set up. So iterative, but the iterative could go either way.
But you're positioning as this is a long-term approach and getting buy-off for that long-term kind of strategy, while you're not necessarily asking for all the money at once. But so it doesn't seem like you're going back and continuing to ask for more. You're getting buy-in for that overall approach up front. Absolutely.
And that's a better way to do it also, because you want there to be understanding that you have a long-term vision in mind. That is a question you will get if you're asking for resources. Well, you said you have needs in this area that's not covered. Are those needs going to go away in a year and a half? And you'll still have a person there. That longer term, even if it's iterative, shows you're thinking through the long-term needs. And that probably is one of the big questions between FTEs and external resources is it a short-term need or a long-term need?
Yeah.
Even if it's important, if it's a short-term need, you should probably be using just highly qualified external resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and perhaps even if it's a longer term need, but because of circumstance and perhaps you're bumping up against FTE limits, you need to go external, that you have a plan of how you're going to ultimately transition that more expensive external resource into an internal hire when you have the ability to do so. Like, what's that transition plan look like? So you're not going to be reliant on expensive external resources, basically forever to fill that role.
That's interesting. And actually, I wouldn't typically see it that way because in theory, they should just go away.
Yeah.
If it's a short term, there's other short term. There's, for example, when you have McKinsey to come in to look with you at a category and identify opportunities. There's that type of short term where nobody's going to question if it's internal or external. The others where it's like a short term need that you just would transition from the expensive outside provider to a less expensive. Do you have a general service provider that you've already outsourced parts of procurement to that you would roll it over to? But I don't think I've ever seen it be transition from a high cost external resource to an FTE.
And so the last question I think I have regarding this is, we talked about business case, making the business case, the when, some of the metrics to use and things like that. But in terms of actual presentation, what have you seen to be successful? What that's best resonated with the executives where you've made these cases? What does that look like? What level of detail do you find that you actually need to go into?
I see the main presentation part around 6 to 7 pages, starting with a nice executive summary that would cover the current situation, your recommendation with a few sentences, and then next steps and what you're looking for from that audience. And you'll have within the few sentences on the recommendation just a reference to the fact that there's other options. Then the next page will generally be just a little bit more detail on the situation and the needs that arise from it, and what is your baseline FTEs, what are the gaps, opportunities, and then another page giving some more detail on your recommended option. Then you'd have, say, a page or two that just outline maybe there's 5 other different options, all the variety of options you looked at with some basics. What is it? What are the pros? What are the cons? And then a page on next steps.
And so for the roles themselves.
And then after that, you have the appendix. I'm sorry?
No, I'm sorry, Alex. I didn't mean to jump into over the top of you. I was just going to ask, for the roles themselves, what level of granularity do you typically find that you are asked? Is it that I'm going to hire a category lead for HR services, or these are the specific roles and responsibilities, this is the value it's going to drive, this is going to be the key stakeholders it's going to interact with? Like, what's the expectations from a prep perspective of level of detail you have from that perspective?
In the main part of the presentation, I'd say you're asking for a category lead for HR.
Yeah.
In the appendix, you'd have, this is the role description, this is the role responsibilities, this is the skills that are required, this is the career path for it. So you have both that general and the more detailed, they're just in 2 different places.
Yeah, you have the ability to drill down and ask any questions if you're asked. I guess the other question, I know I said before that was my final question, but I guess a follow-up question is, let's talk specifically about you're hiring a role for you're making the business case for a category lead for HR services. How involved would the HR, like the head of HR or the VP of HR, whoever would be the key stakeholder, how involved do you bring those into this process?
You bring them in, I don't know if you bring them in, but you're definitely doing almost what you think of as a voice of the customer.
Yeah.
You should be meeting with the senior HR stakeholders anyway. So as you're having your preliminary discussion for the following year, so say it's third quarter, I'm talking to the head of HR about procurement supporting HR going forward. What the head of HR says about the area's needs, risks, what procurement can do to grow the relationship, that is all going to play into you making the recommendation, because you can have the capabilities if the stakeholder is not going to work with you anyway, or if the stakeholder is not going to ask for the services or want to use the services that this role is going to provide, it's just not going to matter.
Yeah.
You would definitely, it's a good point, you would definitely make sure you could reference discussions with HR which indicate that the person will actually have something to do.
Yeah, there's a need
to deepen the relationship and do the work. Yeah.
Right. Well, Alexis, I want to thank you so much for spending the time to really share some of your experiences in this space. It's something that's going to be a really interesting time as we think about how do we staff up to support what is going to be really important for a lot of organizations right now, and how do they bring, forward-thinking, impactful procurement to their organizations to solve some of their challenges when they may be in a resource-constrained environment. So, really important topic. And my final question that I always ask is, if anybody would like to reach out, connect with you, what would be the best place for them to go to find you?
For now, it would be LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I may be setting up a procurement consulting organization, but right now I'd say LinkedIn is the best place to get a hold of me.
Okay, perfect. Well, what I'll do is I'll include the link to your LinkedIn profile in our show notes page. Listeners can find those just by going to the podcast section of our website, which is artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. Alexis, one last time, I want to just thank you so much for spending the time with sharing some of your experiences and for joining us today on the pod. I want to thank you for listening in to my conversation today with Alexis. The big takeaway that I want to highlight is Alexis' guidance to present a business case that includes a long-term staffing plan, even if you're only looking for a single FTE right now. That way, you can both provide the context for where this position fits and a roadmap that's tied to the incremental returns over time of investing in a different number of resources. To subscribe to our newsletter, AOP Insider, and never miss an episode, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe, and you can find our back catalogue of over 320 podcasts from the past 5 years at artofprocurement.com/podcast.